Yes, so back to that question, why is there such an interest? Why are kings and presidents and prime ministers and their kingdoms and their countries and their governments, since time immemorial, so interested in education? And could there be some spiritual implication of that? Plus, that quietness is deafening.
Hi, Mwalimu.
Yes, Boaz.
Yes, I have to speak because it's not that I was ready to start, but your comment has prompted me to. Because your question is real. Education in itself is a weapon that can be used by people to organize, to help transform, or also to subjugate and to indoctrinate. And so it becomes something that people would always want to take control of and influence. That would be my first comment. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you. It's a weapon. It's a weapon for mind control, to indoctrinate, to nationalize people in some countries. And so, yeah, hence much focus and interest in it. Very good. Paul, and then Sam Nyabere, then Juliana.
Yes, Dr. Good evening.
Good evening.
I believe the political interest is because of the economic impact. Because if I give an example of a governments which are made mostly a good percentage of politicians, or in one way or another political, they believe they have ideologies. Each government, each political organization, they normally have ideologies. Like some can have an ideology on economic empowerment, and so a well-educated workforce would be more innovative and productive to foster that economic impact. Secondly, organizations like political organizations normally compete. For instance, you might have countries or governments competing on each other, either regional or international. And through education, a certain government or one government can put itself on a good level to compete with the other governments. Thank you. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. And I like your reference to ideologies. And there's no other way of pushing ideologies other than through education. Okay, very well put. Very well put. Sam Nyabere, then Juliana Magomere.
Thank you, sir, and good evening to everyone. I wanted to add to what Brother Boaz was talking about, how education is a weapon. Just to add that I think, if I'm not wrong, it's Nelson Mandela who said that education is the most powerful weapon against poverty. And so to bring about equality of human beings, they need an education, because if you think about it, when we have an education, it makes us equal, that we can all fight for opportunities on an equal footing. And I wanted to add that while there are governments don't make decisions for everyone. Individuals all the time make decisions. And in doing so, they need to be logical in their decision making, and as they interact with each other, they need to think critically as they build relationships. critical thinking and rationalizing issues come with education. I might not know what the spiritual aspect to education is in terms of the politics involved, but I believe that what I have said makes a contribution to your question. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Sam. Yeah, what you're saying is actually hinting onto the spiritual aspect of why education is so critical to political leadership. And again, thank you for adding on to that. So, into contributing to Boaz's initial contribution about education being a weapon, I like your take that it could also be a weapon for good, for empowerment, for development, and for getting rid of vices such as underdevelopment and poverty. Thank you so much, Sam. Juliana, and then Oluoch, and I think I'd also seen Othello's hand up. So let's go by that order: Juliana, Oluoch, and then Othello. Then I'll proceed and also make my contribution.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mnya. So just to add on to what my colleagues have also mentioned about building a workforce for the country, so that you can even export part of that, whatever you have built to other countries. So building also a name that in the end will build a name for your country. So if Kenya, for example, has this particular maybe economic force, it can give it to other countries also, so that they are building a name for themselves. Then the other thing would be, it's an expectation, especially for the Sustainable Development Goals, that as a nation, education is one of those goals that a country should be able to fulfill. So part of the development goals, the sustainable development goals of a nation. Then the other thing is, so why political interest? Some of these political people want to build a name for themselves, so they start schools and then name it after themselves. So that part of building a name for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you, Juliana. So there's a political interest in terms of people wanting to leave a legacy. So even beyond schools, some even begin systems. They ensure that there's a transition of educational systems that will be part of their legacies. All right. Thank you. Oluoch.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone who has also shared quite some good insights. So from my point of view, I would begin by saying that education is liberating. It is liberating. But at the same time, it has two faces, so it is also enslaving. And I say so because in our first semester classes on policy, it seems the denominator of it was that politics is about interests, and policies were also based on interests. And so political power, getting the best policies that serve folks' interests, may actually be based on manipulating education so that it may have people acquiesce to the interest of the folks. And therefore, this is where I say it is enslaving. I still recall during the Nyayo philosophy, if you look at it and all those elements of Nyayo milk and our loyalty pledge and elements of education being based on things like the first person to see Mount Kenya, the ministers of Kenya, all those kind of things. It was enslaving education. It makes you acquiesce to the interest of the other folks. But on the other hand, there is education is liberating from these interests. And so you will find that education may be stifled if it may lead to a liberation where people begin to see, have clarity on some of the political interests that folks have, and therefore rebel against those folks. So I think the interest of Nate is that education in the context of political interest, policy as interest, etc., is double-edged sword in terms of liberation and enslavement. Over to you.
Thank you, Oluoch Madiang, for that. I think your answer is so crisp and clear, and also pointing to where we are heading with this discussion today, as we go to the foundations of what you just said. But I like the synergy in the way the responses are coming tonight, because it starts from education is a weapon, education is good for development, for eradicating poverty. Then for some selfish political interests, education is draws or attracts interest. Then to as much as it is good for freeing people, can also be used to enslave minds, and create around what some better called philosophies that actually drive people. So what you're saying is so important, because it's going to lead us into understanding now the foundations. Why did things happen the way they did, if we can trace this back to history? And so this explains, it explains why you would have a country like North Korea. And is it still Kim Jong-un? Is he still the president? And this, I think, has been a family inherited position of being the leader of North Korea. A highly, yes, thank you. A highly oppressed people. But you tell them that they are oppressed, you'll be surprised that they can eat you up for pointing that out to them, that you actually have been colonized in the mind through a philosophy, through education. So you meet a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 9-year-old, 10-year-old from North Korea who is so patriotic that you wonder how they will ever see anything else apart from what they know. All right. So anyway, so I like all your responses, because they in agreement with mine. That why interest in education by regimes? Because education shapes societies. It shapes societies. So societies are shaped after the education, the leadership of the place, but also to control the perception and thinking of a nation. So mind control, that has been said also, but also to regulate governance. Sometimes for governments and those who run governments to be able to govern, they have to have a unified way of thinking. And one of the ways of entrenching this is by entrenching their philosophies in education. Okay. Ruth adds in the chat segment that I guess education can be viewed as a spiritual pursuit, in the sense that it shapes character, ethics, and wisdom. Yes, again, on a positive note, you can say that. But this is why it gains all that interest. And so to speak, if the pursuit to shape societies by education, to control thinking, I don't like the word control, but manipulate, say the same word, but sort of to shape thinking of a nation and regulate governance, that can also be steered towards a good direction, a Godward direction. And we'll see the foundations here. Some biblical foundations. We're going to look at Moses. and his education background. We're going to look at Daniel and his education, and also the education and schooling of Paul, and see how these foundations are repetitive in today's societies. So you realize that these are patterns, and these patterns are as old as the Bible days. All right. So let's start with Moses, and I'm going to be calling upon us to assist me with reading. So I need a volunteer to read Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. And another, the one who read Exodus chapter 2, verse 10 will also read 11. But I need a second volunteer to open Acts chapter 7, and we'll read 3 verses, actually 4 verses, 20, 21, 22, and 23. Yes, Mwalimu, which one are you on?
I am going to read Acts chapter 7.
20 to 23. So let's start with Jimmy. Jimmy, will you read Exodus 2:10 and 2:11?
Exodus
Chapter 2, verse 10 to 11. 2, 10 and 11.
Yes, I'll do.
Okay.
Exodus chapter 2, verses 10 up to 11, isn't it?
Yes.
That the Bible says, when the child grew older,
No, 10 and 11, just 2 verses. Sorry. Oh, yeah, you're there. Okay.
I think I'm there.
Yeah, please proceed. Yeah.
Okay. Exodus chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
All
you.
right. Great. So, between Exodus chapter 2, verse 10, where we're seeing, and I'm just jumping to these scriptures because I'm assuming you know the stories, eh? I hope I'm making a good assumption that you know the story of how Moses was rescued from a genocide against Jewish kids. Okay, so Pharaoh was after Jewish boys and killing them through an order, but then God miraculously saved Moses. So you see that rescuing and being saved, being taken by Pharaoh's daughter in verse 10. Next verse you see is 11. And in between is 40 years gap. The Moses in verse 10 is a child. The Moses in verse 11 is a grown-up man. And it's 40 years gap. Right? But we're not told that here in Exodus. Where are we told about this? We actually get to see this in Acts chapter 7, where Stephen, the very first deacon to be stoned to death, when the persecution against the church arose, Stephen is making the very final submissions to Sanhedrin before he was stoned. And he gave a long narrative of God's redemptive plan from the beginning and establishment of the world to where they were. And he talks about Moses. So that's where I think Moku is going to read for us. Now, the
Yeah.
Moses that is appearing, the Moses that is appearing before Pharaoh is about 80 years. So that 40 years gap now makes sense. Yes, Mwalimu.
So Acts chapter 7, verse 20 to 23. At this time, Moses was born and was well pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel.
Okay. So you see, now that is explained by Stephen in this passage. So what you're not seeing in Exodus is clarified here. That having been saved by Pharaoh's daughter, who brought him up as his own son, her own son, sorry. And then verse 22, you read a very important verse, which for us is the underlining word for our discussion. And Moses was instructed, some versions say educated, in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. Next thing you see in verse 23 is that he was 40 years old. Okay, so look at that progression of history regarding Moses' life. When you hear that he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, remember we are talking about the first world of the time, the top civilization of the world at the time was Egyptian, marked by their education. So he was educated in Egyptian civilization. But don't forget that Moses in himself was a Jewish child, raised by an Egyptian girl, but the girl did not actually raise Moses, but handed Moses over to a Jewish slave woman, a slave mother. So a slave mother raised Moses on behalf of Egyptian's daughter. So we have that context, right? So just getting into his early education, and these sources I've gotten from early Egyptian historian, a Jewish historian, and an early church historian, Manetho, Josephus, and Eusebius. Manetho is an Egyptian historian. Josephus was a Jewish historian. Eusebius was an early church historian. And they all agree that Moses was educated at Heliopolis, a school for nobility. So this was a school for, let's say, dynasty of the time. All the nobles took their kids to be educated at Heliopolis. And of course, you know, Moses is growing up in the family of Pharaoh. So what do you expect? So here he learned writing, he learned mathematics. In mathematics, according to these historians, they go into the details of geometry, trigonometry, and even the ability to measure and lay out land, right? So he really studied a lot of things, including history, medicine, music, military, combat, even war. But also he learned languages, all right? He learned Hebrew too. And so that explains him writing the 5 books of the law, what we call today the Pentateuch, all written in Hebrew. So how is it that a child growing up in an Egyptian background and family knows how to write Hebrew? All right. So the writing of Pentateuch was made possible by Moses' early exposure to this kind of education. Okay? So Moses must have been taught about the law in Heliopolis. He must have been taught the Egyptian law, of course. Why? Because he was in Egypt. But also he learned about the laws of other nations. So this would be like the Harvard of the time, where you have children from other nobilities in the world coming to study in that university. So of course, he was exposed to the laws of other nations. And one of the most famous law codes of the day was the law code of the Hammurabi of Babylon. So Babylon too was a superpower of some sort. He got exposed to all this. So the king in the law code of Hammurabi of Babylon, there is this understanding that the king enters into an agreement with the people and he is going to protect them. So that is an agreement that I am going to become your king and I am going to protect you. And the people must agree to obey the king's laws. That was a code of law, the law code of Hammurabi of Babylon. All right? So the Old Testament laws, particularly the Ten Commandments that Moses wrote, are actually patterned in more or less, it takes same kind of treaty formulation, whereby God is telling a people, the Israelites, that I am going to be your king and I am going to protect you as long as you obey my laws. So you must obey my laws if I am going to be your king and if you want to enjoy my protection. So the writings of the Old Testament laws is not coming out of the blues or out of nowhere. No. Moses is coming from a certain education system. And that education system formed his thinking that way. So the people have to obey God and do what he says because he is the God who brought them out of Egypt. Now, I want you to pause at that point and remember that God's intention for having a people of his own, rescuing them from slavery, driving them through the wilderness onto the promised land. His primary intention for doing that was to form a model of governance, that we call theocracy. God was after forming a theocratic nation, a theocratic government, whereby God was going to be the ruler, the king, and everyone else would be his subjects. And this model was to, over the years, become the pattern of the neighboring nations, so that neighboring nations would see the uniqueness of this nation called Israel and desire to be like them, desire to be drawn to God this way. That was the original intention. Obviously, you and I know that the opposite happened, that the people started to desire kings, human kings, when they saw that everyone else around them had a king. So they too also demanded to have a human king. And lo and behold, you know what they got? They regretted it. So, but for God to shape, to create a theocratic, or to create a theocracy, education had to be at the center of it. education had to be at the center of it. So what you're seeing in the hindsight of Moses' early education is in essence shaping what would have been the education system of Israel as a people. And so the law is basically patterned after this. Even in the writing of the Pentateuch, you get to some passages of scripture and you realize there is a way in which God wanted the children to be educated. Okay, it was so important for him. In fact, let me ask somebody to read for us Deuteronomy. I hope I can get it. Deuteronomy 22. There's a passage that I've actually have. Let me look for it. Just very quickly, very quickly. It's supposed to be Deuteronomy 6. I'm sorry, Deuteronomy 6, not 22. Deuteronomy 6, 4 to 9. Can I get a volunteer? Now, this is how the Jewish children were to be educated. That is Liz Mudhoni.
Oh, thank you. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, right?
Yes.
NKJV version. Sorry?
Okay. Yeah, 4, 5. 4, 5, 6, and up to 9.
All right. Do you have a specific version or I can use the one I have?
Use the one that you have.
New King James. All right. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. 8. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. 9. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. That's the last verse 9.
Thank you very much, Liz. And ladies and gentlemen, as you have heard that being read, that is how the children of Israel were schooled. You must have heard of that famous verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Shama call. The Lord is one, meaning you have one king, you have one Lord, you have one president, you shall have no other. And to entrench that thinking and how you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul and your might, all right? This is how you shall teach your children. Teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk to them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. I mean, this is 247 education system every time. And beyond that, you must also emphasize that with teaching aids. What are the teaching aids? Verse 8, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. More teaching aid, verse 9, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Can you imagine? Right? I was waiting to make this comment because Francis Ochami had earlier commented that education has a focus on shaping citizens, promoting loyalty. Highlight that. Promoting loyalty and preparing individuals for their roles in society. This was it. Okay. Francis continues, education has been and is a tool for rulers to instill values, maintain control, and ensure the continuity of their kingdoms through the development of an educated and skilled populace. It's exactly what we are seeing here. This was the blueprint. So for those who are asking for the reading, it's from Deuteronomy 6, 4-9. So that was the way an Egyptian child, an Israeli child was trained. Okay. And so you must understand that this is not just coming from the blues. There are parallels between these earlier law codes and how the Mosaic law is presented. So Moses is not just writing. He is writing in accordance with the education or the way the laws were patterned in the education that he got from Egypt, one of the best. And God allowed him to go through that education for this purpose. Okay. So what we see in Acts chapter 7, yes, Florence Machio.
Sorry, Mwalimu.
Mhm.
Apologies for joining late. I've been away, but I'm curious about one aspect. That when Moses was born, Pharaoh was killing children, and Moses is saved and goes to Pharaoh's house, and is raised by the daughter. So God orchestrated it because there was no education at that time from the Israelites, or there was a gap in education at that particular time, because the kind of education that he was being given was to lead him to be at this particular point that we are discussing. I am just thinking loud. What was the education then?
Okay. Thank you, Florence, for the question. I think I had mentioned that Egypt was a superpower of the time. So Egypt was like the first world of the time, very high leveled in technology, high education, and actually the education systems or schools, centers of Egypt ended up becoming the go-to places in their world. So the schools, especially where nobilities went,
Daktari, where is he? You're muted.
okay, so
Daktari.
yeah, sorry,
Okay.
sorry.
You're back.
I was sorting out an issue here. So now, what we are seeing is that education, even look at the world at the time, was all running to Egypt for purposes of accessing this education, but not everyone had access to it. You had to be part and parcel of the nobility. So, but also remember that the Jewish people were what? Were slaves. So, all they had with them was the Jewish education that was informal, but that could not be a reference point for anyone. Why? Because they were slaves. So Moses is privileged through disguise, a blessing in disguise, that through him being saved, he lands into the nobility, becomes part of the nobility, and gains access to this high-level education, like the Harvard of the time. Yes, Othello.
Thank you, Daktari. I just wanted to say something in relation to what you were talking about, Egypt being the first world. Interestingly, the first world has become the third world now. The world has advanced. So this is the center of power in Alexandria was actually the center of education in the world. As you rightly put it, you talk about the nobilities. Not everybody who could, just people could go to Alexandria. And for me, I'm tempted to think that the Israelis, when they were slaves, I think they were the people involved in building these pyramids that we're seeing. And today, in civilization that we're living in, no modern engineering architecture has been able to replicate the pyramid. They have tried very hard, but they cannot. They have been unable to replicate the pyramid. You can see this is highly scientific and highly sophisticated. The pyramid that we're seeing there built in Egypt. No modern technology has been able to replicate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Othello, for that. Yeah, and in addition to that, actually, when you're saying that, you're reminding me that we have in Egypt one of the biggest, the largest, the most elaborate libraries in the world. Anyone knows of this library? Let me just ask, which city is it in? The city of?
A library.
Sorry? It's in Alexandria, right? We have one of the largest libraries in the world. It's a tourist destination, but also still it's an ongoing library. And a lot of education centers have emerged out of it, especially those that are focused in the discipline of history and the Mediterranean world. So anyway, so what we see in Acts chapter 7, according to the speech by Stephen before he was murdered, is that Moses had become mighty in speech and action. In fact, the ancient, the Jewish historian Josephus says that he had at some point become a military commander. This is not surprising, since a high-born Egyptian son would be expected to fight in wars. That was it. And not just Egyptian, but also other nations, neighboring nations that had powerful militaries. Their children children in the nobilities had to fight in wars, and therefore they went to the best academies for that. Egypt was the go-to place. So he captured the cities of Hermopolis and Saba, according to Josephus. This is a military man. This is a military commander. And so this actually explains Moses' role as the general over Joshua. If you now you are tuned to the biblical history of the time, during the battles that they sometimes faced in the wilderness, Moses would assume the role of a general over Joshua. So Joshua would become like the front man, the soldier who would go, but then Moses was the mind behind the military activity. So I'm just saying all this so that you see the role that education played in Moses' life. And why is this so important? This education background is so important for Moses because God allowed it to prepare him for the work ahead. So what one of us said earlier, it was in preparation for what was to come ahead. Okay, but this is the strangest thing that happened. Remember, all this time that Moses is being raised under Pharaoh's household, Pharaoh's daughter handed Moses to be raised by a Jewish slave mother, even breastfeeding. In fact, Moses was breastfed by a Jewish slave mother. And so you can imagine even the bringing up of this child is by this mother. And you know how mothers have a strong influence on the child and as the child is developing. So over time, the Egyptian education, as profound as it was, as mighty and as high and mighty as it was overshadowed by the education he received from the slave mother. So she taught him about God. And I'm just thinking, what do you think she was telling? What do you think she might have taught Moses? Just a question to the class. What else, apart from God, what else do you think this slave mother was teaching Moses as he was growing up? Othello.
Thank you, Daktari. I believe this lady, the slave mother, was actually Moses' mother. And then she decided to let the sister of Moses to go and watch over the baby as they set the baby along the bank of the Nile and to watch over to see what will happen because all the male children were supposed to be killed at the time. So when they gave birth to Moses, they had to bring him and kept him in the house for some time. Then they brought him over now and they set him to see what will happen. So the girl, the daughter, the slave mother's daughter was set to set watch over Moses over the basket. Then when Pharaoh's daughter came to take a bath, then she saw the baby. Say, oh, this is a very nice baby. No, she just realized these people, because their babies have been killed, could be one of them and try and set this baby here. So she took the baby to herself, and then the little girl was nearby. So she asked this little girl to go and look for somebody who can take care of the baby. And the little girl went and called the mother, and Moses' mother was to take care. So for me, she was teaching him about the Jews and who they are. I think that is how Moses got to know when he grew up there. He came back to see his people. So I think for me now, that's my personal thinking, that she was just teaching him their culture, who they are, and what they were doing in Egypt. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Yeah, the culture, their people, what they were doing. So you must have mentioned one or two things about their people, their history, their culture. Very good. Zipporah and then Chris.
Thank you so much.
Daktari, allow me to Daktari, allow me to interject before Zipporah. My carrying up of the hand is not to contribute. I've just logged into the class. Kindly, if I may know the top discussion, so that then I'm able to listen to my colleagues, please.
Sorry, if you may know
what is the topic of the day?
Oh, it's the
what is the topic of the day?
It's the political economy of education.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the political economy of education.
Thank you.
Okay, here's Zipporah.
Thank you so much, Doc. I just want to give an addition. So according to me, the mother who was the nurse to Moses was teaching him about the Jewish culture and traditions in preparation of future leadership, which remember, it was God's plan that Moses was going to be a leader. So God really wanted Moses, despite of the fact that Moses was brought up in Egypt, God wanted Moses to retain his culture and tradition. So he wanted the culture and the tradition of the Jews so that it could act as a basis of his leadership. Thank you.
To act as a basis of his leadership. So the culture, the life, the everything around him That must have been the intention. Thank you, Zipporah, for that. Truly appreciate. So I think the Jewish slave mother must have taught him about the miraculous deliverance. First of all, his own deliverance by the hand of God when Pharaoh massacred the Jewish boys. You know that just after Moses' birth, Pharaoh executed a genocide of children, a genocide of boys. And I had someone talking somewhere, I think sharing in a paper that that's when the number of boys decreased, because after that we see a recurrence of the same by Herod in the New Testament, again targeting boys, and our numbers have never been the same again. Anyway, I digress. So the miraculous deliverance of the hand of God when Pharaoh was massacred was killing the boys, the Jewish boys. So she must have told him about this. She must have told him about the sovereignty and providence of God in all this, about how Israelites found themselves in Egypt as a small family through Joseph, how the family grew, how Jews grew in numbers and overwhelmed, started threatening Pharaoh until they were put into slavery, and how God had providentially been with them to this point. She must have told him about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the forefathers, because they were very central to the Jewish history. Must have taught him about the Jewish traditions, because how else did Moses know Hebrew in the first place? Then about the 400 years were nearly over. The 400 years that the Israelites had been put into slavery by Egyptians, and God had promised them a deliverer. So these 400 years were nearly over, and God would deliver his people from slavery. Perhaps this slave mother might have mentioned to Moses that you could be the one, you could be the deliverer. No wonder God has spared you as the only Jewish boy child after the massacre. These are just my thinking as to what might have, because this education was so strong that eventually overpowered what Moses had acquired in the Egyptian system. But nonetheless, the Egyptian education was high profile. It was useful. It was highly useful in the hands of God to have Moses do the bidding of God and deliver his people. Eugene is saying, I think the teachings from the mother helped to reinforce his identity and by essence, his allegiance, and prepared him for his purpose and destiny. I cannot help but draw a parallel to Daniel's story together with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which is going to be our next discussion, by the way. Paul Amata says she must have taught him how to keep safe. Being from minority group, Moses would have needed to be cautious about his actions and associations. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So yeah, we also read, actually, thank you for pointing that out. How can we forget that? That earlier on, we read in the chapter that Moses was no ordinary child. So there was something unique and special about Moses. And how do we know that he was no ordinary child? Perhaps this Jewish slave mother told him that knowing the way you have been rescued by God and that you're alive now, you're just no ordinary child. Something must be special about you. All right, because who puts a baby in a river and eventually the baby is rescued and somehow the baby lands into the hands of Pharaoh's daughter who adopts the baby? That's miraculous. Anyway, Paul mentions about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and that's our next lot. After Moses and his education background, you've seen how that was shaped in educating Moses to be the person that he was. We see a similar parallel with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, somebody please read us, go to Daniel chapter 1. Let's just go to Daniel chapter 1. We're going to dwell there for some time. And I would like a volunteer. Actually, I would like 3 volunteers. Daniel chapter 1. Yes, we have Othello. Othello will read verse 1 and 2. We haven't heard from Stella. Stella will read 3. Then Florence Machio will read 4 and 5. Okay. Then Helen G will read 6 to 7. Let's read those verses first. Othello, verse 1 and 2 of Daniel chapter 1.
Okay, verse 1 and 2 of chapter 1. Okay. I'm reading from New King James Version.
Yes.
In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. That's the word of the Lord.
Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles.
Very good reading. Let's stop at that. We'll proceed with the others. But from what Othello has read, you already see the political setting. And this for me makes the connection between the political interests in education. You see, said in the third year of the reign, that's a regime. The reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, now a colonist king, a colonial king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, basically took over. Occupationist kind of colonialism. So occupied Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. So this is God's doing. Can you imagine? This is God taking Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into captivity, into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So basically, Nebuchadnezzar captures not just the people, but also the religious equipment. All right, the religious vessels,
the religious artifacts.
The artifacts, exactly. I'm looking for that word. The religious artifacts, the religious and cultural symbols of the people, brought them into his palace, but not even the palace, even further to the shrine where Nebuchadnezzar worshipped idols, an idol god. Okay, so I want to remind you that Jewish system, going back to what we read in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6, was also entrenched into this temple symbolism. So also brings with him the education of the people into a foreign land. But listen to this. Let's proceed, because what we've read after Othello, which is the political setting being set, we see the socio-economic setting also being set in verse 3, where the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief of eunuchs, because then they were served by eunuchs only in the palace, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish. Look at that description. I really wanted us to hear verses 4 and 5, but let's read that first. Who have I assigned verses 4 and 5?
Me.
Is it Florence?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, read 4 and 5. Listen to the description of the people that the Jewish young men that King Nebuchadnezzar ordered to be brought into the palace to serve him.
I read verse 4. I'm reading the Amplified Version. Young men without blemish and handsome in appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with intelligence and discernment, and quick to understand, competent to stand in the presence of the king, and able to serve in the king's palace. He also ordered Ashpenaz to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Verse 5, the king assigned a daily ration for them from his finest food and from the wine which he drank. They were to be educated and nourished this way for 3 years, so that at the end of that time, they were prepared to enter the king's service. End of verse 5.
Okay, very good. Very good, very good. So you're seeing that the learning background is also being set. The learning background is also being set. First of all, the king has ordered that some of the men who've been captured from Judah be brought in, but they're not just men. They are coming from a certain socio-economic setting. In fact, the verse says from the royal family, from nobility. And their description is such that they are without blemish, good looking, skillful with knowledge and understanding and learning. Learning from what? From the Jewish education system. But now, look at what's going to happen. Now, from what has just been read by Machio, you see that the king wants to recreate their education, wants to redefine their education, because it is important for the king. It's not just happening. It is important for the king. It's important for the ruler that they take after a certain education platform. So this is now where they get colonized, including the education background gets colonized. Someone read for us 6 to 7. Had I assigned anyone 6 to 7?
Yes.
Daktari, excuse me, Daktari,
Yes,
before Helen
hello.
reads, can I just say something before Helen comes in?
Yes, Othello.
Daktari, we have been taken back to where we started when Boaz and Madian, they were talking about that aspect of education to control and to manipulate people. It is exactly where we have come to, because the guy wants a sophistication of this education to be in the system and to bring people who have that knowledge and skill to be indoctrinated.
Yes, yes. Yeah, thank you, Othello. Yes, yes.
I also have an addition on that.
Yes, Chris.
Yeah, Othello was almost speaking my mind. I was just thinking that with the explanation and what the king is doing, isn't this radicalization that he can be able to to control people so that he can be able to speak, and then people will want to do according to what he says. Was a form of radicalization. If I critique that, maybe not from theological point of view, philosophically.
Yes, and that's what you're right. That's what I'm calling colonization. It's simply put, colonization, and we'll see how that will happen in a short while.
Mwalimu, I also had my hand up.
Yes, boss.
Yeah, sorry. I think in addition to the areas asked by my colleagues, I'm a little bit concerned about the qualities that are ascribed to those to be selected. I'm making this within the knowledge of the creation story, where in the image of God, he created them. All these people are God's image. So when you ascribe such characteristics, which I think you say good looking, things like that, what exactly do you mean? Or is there a context to that which you could explain for?
Mwalimu, can I answer Boaz? Boaz, I think when Daktari is talking about good looking there, maybe Daktari, if I'm wrong, you can say it. It's that these guys, they come from a family where they were well fed. And when they are good looking, they are well fed, they eat well, and they come up well. They are not coming from malnourished sector of society. That's how I look at it. Mwalimu, take over, please.
Yeah, very closely, and to respond to that, Boaz, is basically they were good looking. They shouldn't have had any deformity, so they were good looking. They were in good shape physically, but also intellectually, so that they would be able to serve the state house all the time. So you can imagine the king wants the best for himself, not just any captive. Because also remember, these were captives. These were political prisoners. So I think that answers. So it's not in the sense of whether they were better people than others from the point of creation, but that, remember, this is a heathen pagan king, and all he wants is masculine men who can do the chores of the palace all the time. And so they had to have all these features. Zipporah, I see your hand up. Helen, please hold on. Your reading is coming. I'm sorry, we have interjected.
Can
Yes,
I say
Zipporah.
that good looking to mean they were wise? They were wise?
Yes, but you see the scripture also is very clear. It sets the parameters. Let me go to the verse again. One, they were coming from nobility. So they were coming from a wealthy background. They had no deformities, so they were well built. Good appearance means, they were handsome, basically. Skillful in all wisdom. So they were also endowed with knowledge and understanding and learning. They were brilliant, competent to stand in the king's palace. They had all the good features that you would want in a slave. I think this is a slave driving mentality, which takes us back to when you remember the slave drivers of the African continent. They were just picking the best. I think it's the same thinking. They were picking well-built people, masculine, tall, with big features, so that they could farm the cotton plantations. People who could withstand that. And for the females, they looked for strong women who would, bear big children with big features, basically to be used as animals in the farm. So So it's the same thinking of slave driving here. So you have to get all the best features to be able to serve as slaves. Does that make sense, Zipporah?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So, so Helen, now listen to this. Listen to the colonization bit.
Thank you, Daktari. I'm going to read from the King James Version. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego.
Exactly. So the names change. The names change. Why? What is the symbolism of this? They had names. They had Jewish names. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But why the change of names in this context?
Baptize them in their tradition and their ways of thinking, their naming of people. I think it's baptism of into their culture, indoctrination, everything is coming in.
Yeah. And so one, why are they called Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?
Should we explain this in the context of just Old Testament, or maybe linking it with the New Testament?
Yeah, you can even link it with the New Testament.
Right. During baptism, you are renewed. You become a new person. You're baptized, and baptism, you have to go through some education. You have to go through some teachings. Now, in this context, after the king entered them, they were taken through classes. They were taught the culture. They were taught how to behave in the society, and particularly while in the palace. And therefore, the reason why these people's names are changing is simply because to inculcate them to the new way of living of the Jews culture. And that's the reason why they have to change their names. A symbol of renewal.
The Persian culture, please. Brother Chris.
Yes. A symbol of renewal and acceptance.
Yeah.
So it's basically encountering them, and I like your usage of words. It agrees with what Paul has written, assimilation. All right, assimilation. So to assimilate and concretize the colonization process, because naming does something. All right, naming does something. When you name something, you create ownership of that thing. It doesn't mean that it didn't have a name, because a name carries identity. All right. So, for instance, did Lake Victoria have a name before it was called Lake Victoria? Teachers of history here.
Rudolph.
Yeah, Malibu, I think I've forgotten that
Yes,
name,
it
but
did.
It had a name. It had a local name, right?
Yes.
It was called Lolwe.
Yeah. It had a name. But then someone else
It had
comes
a
and
name, yes.
yeah, someone else comes and thinks it should have a
Yes,
name
exactly.
of a ruler. All right. So when you do that, you're basically ripping off that item from the soul of its original people. You're taking away the soul of that item because it's intricately connected and linked to the origin of the people. All right. Yes, Frank.
Yes, good evening, Daktari.
Good evening.
So I think basically those names, they had meanings related to the God of Israel. But when they were changed to this other one, they related to the names of the Babylonian other gods. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what I'm waiting for. Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego were heathen gods, were Babylonian gods. All right. And so that's why earlier on, my question had to do with, it had something to do with what is the religious connection in this? Why is education, what is the spiritual implication of why regimes are so interested in controlling the education system of a country, of a nation? Yes, Nyawita.
Yes, Dr. What I wanted to say was just to add on that. If you read Daniel 4:8, Nebuchadnezzar confesses that he named Daniel after his own God. That's what I just wanted to add.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. It was just after his own God. Absolutely. Thank you, Nyawita. Zipporah?
They have religious significance.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say is that the names as identity. So to me, my understanding is that they wanted to transform Daniel and the other members to be like them.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to make them be like them. So basically change the identity and take it away from its original people and convert it completely for purposes of their own end. And so that has been the pattern of the renaming of places and people ever since. All right. That explains why we are where we are. Okay. Where we have a Paul here, we have a Chris here, we have a Cindy, we have Evans, Eugene. All right. It explains it all. So, so that aspect of colonization had to take place, but beginning from the point of miseducation. Miseducation so that people could be controlled, because it's one thing to capture people, it's another thing to maintain those that you have captured. All right. But then that's why we are seeing over and over today aspects of, there's a recurrent theme around decolonization. If you're a writer, if you're a scholar and you're writing articles a lot lately, you'll always come across call for papers, and they will always have a sub-theme under decoloniality or decolonial conversations. All right. So that decolonization did not just start the other day. Look at what happens in verses 8 to 15. Now, I want new readers, people who have not read.
I will read, Dr. from verse 17.
Yes, from verse 8. Sorry. From verse 17. From verse 17, yeah.
Okay. The Bible says that...
No. Let's start from 8 because we want to see the decolonization itself.
So I start from 8?
8 to 15. First read 8 to 15. Let me get this straight. So that's Juliet. Let me get someone else read 17 to 20.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Janie will read 17 to 20, and then Maureen Gunjiri will read verse 21. So let's start with you.
Okay, I'm doing from verse 18, the ESV version.
8,
From
8,
8,
8.
sorry, from verse 8, thank you. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord, the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in the worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. I've done up to 15.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And you've read very well. Now, you see that prior to that, the king had ordered that these 4 be put under special diet, the very best of king's diet, so that they would now complete the colonization. So they come into the agenda of the king. Remember, king's food was not just king's food. It was prepared in all aspects, even had a spiritual implication into what you're consuming. But they said, no, we shall not defile ourselves with some of this food, because some of them included what was not permitted for a Jewish person to eat, meat that had been considered to be not proper for eating. But then they said, put us on a diet, a separate diet. In fact, from what you have read, it looks like a vegetarian diet. Now, who gets fat out of a vegetarian diet? Because what we are reading towards the end of what you have just read is that at the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh. What do you call that? Than all the youths who ate the king's food. Yet, the king's food was fat, it was, meat and lots of wine and all that. So how do you explain that? So this had to be supernatural intervention by God's favor and grace that it happened that way. So Daniel begins a decolonization journey, a decolonial journey to undo what the education of the Babylonians was trying to do to them. All right. Now, this is what now I call the journey from learning to education. Let me get the person who wants to read 17 to 20 as you listen carefully. Listen to that. 17 to 20.
Okay, verse 17. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Verse 18. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hannah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. Verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm.
Wow. Listen to that. Now, that is the journey from learning, just mere learning, to education. Because a real education does exactly that. It transforms you from just head knowledge to a transformative person who impacts the life around you, such that even after testing, after interviewing, none of the young men could compare to the four. They had in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them. They were actually, the Bible says, 10 times better. I don't know whether I'm driving you to something here. And then you can see where I'm heading.
Sorry,
Yes,
pardon.
Julia.
Repeat that point. Education transforms you from the head knowledge to, please.
To impacting the society around you. Impacting your environment. So we must ask ourselves, because this was a regime that was being shaped and patterned after Babylon, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. But we see these four men in defiance of a colonial education system that was against their not only heritage, but their God. You see, Daniel mentions God a number of times here, claiming of how he must not go against his Lord, his God. And look at what is given to them. You know, they are 10 times better than everyone else, but also more than that, they gain a lot of wisdom and understanding. They are able to interpret dreams and visions. Basically, they gain everything that you want in a good education to save a people. They're in God's mission. Okay? Quite interesting here. And so my argument here is that we see an end of a political dispensation in verse 21. Somebody was to read us verse 21. I think it was Maureen, yeah. 21.
Yes. Verse 21, and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
Until the end of the first year of King Cyrus. Now look at that. And a political dispensation ends, we get into another dispensation. So that regime had completely come to a close. And Daniel is shaping an education system for the people at the time, and especially those who are in captivity, those who had been taken to exile in Babylon. Now, Wita, is it a question?
It's not a question, it's just a thought. That we see, we celebrate Daniel, Shadrach, the four Hebrew boys for standing for what they believed in, and God actually rewarding their standing. But it surprises me that even today we are very intolerant to people who want to practice their faith, especially in the school setup. I remember with the students who don't belong, let's say Seventh-day Adventist goes to a school that's not Seventh-day Adventist, and they are punished for choosing not to go to class on a Saturday. Their exams are now put on the very Saturday, and when they don't do, some are even expelled. And I'm wondering if Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remained true and we applaud them for being true to their faith, why are we still being very intolerant to people who just want to practice their faith? Is it being hypocritical on the Christian part, or what is it that's ailing us? Thank you.
Wow, I like your thinking in that.
Daktari, can I air in something?
Yes, Chris.
Interesting. We come from different cultures where we practice our traditional culture, and even before Christianity came in, Africans knew God, and each and every one of us comes from a community where we were worshiping God in a certain way. Yeah, those of us who come from Bungoma, we used to worship from a place called Namuima. Yeah, and so in answering Nyawita, I feel that it is because of what the king was doing that Africans, we have been meant to go through the same. We have been radicalized by the so-called the Western people to believe that Jesus Christ is the savior, and then forget that we had our own gods. For example, we had Were Hakaba, Were Mumbi, and so forth. In Mulungu, we had all those types of names that we called our forefathers, we are our gods. And therefore, it actually beats logic for Nyawita to question this, because then where did the problem begin? It began from the point we accepted to be radicalized, to be colonized, to believe that the God of the Mzungu is the real God and not of the African. Thank you.
Daktari.
Yes, good, Nyawita.
Thank you, Brother Wekesa, for that. But Daktari, if you will just give me a little for a minute to say this, that why would a learned friend like Wekesa leave his original worship and even not go back to it after all this knowledge if he thinks that it actually makes sense, like the faith that we came from a leg? But if others have come to believe a given faith, if Wekesa, for example, believes he should worship his God in the morning and he sticks to that, why should we, especially claiming to be of the scholarly class, punish him for choosing to worship God according to the dictates of his mind? Because that was the foundational principle of religious liberty. Why are we of the scholarly level feeling that someone who wants to worship God according to the dictates of their mind is in error? Why do you think he is whitewashed and not us? Thank you.
Wow, good question.
Daktari, Nyawita is introducing the philosophy of religion. Very interesting.
So do you want to respond to that? Let's hear others. Let's hear Obadiah and Othello and then Gaki.
Yes.
Daktari, I think we can
Questions
give
for
chance to
allowing me
others
to
for the
speak.
time being,
And
because
just
I have some
to
colleagues around who are also having a class, so I don't want a clash to happen. Actually, Chris is raising a very interesting topic. I think I disagree. We have to have a point of divergence here in this aspect of white people's God. Probably, I think white people may have come to introduce to us, but the God that we serve, I don't think is white people's God. So maybe I will elaborate on this when they have some quietness around me. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Othello. Now, Obadiah, you were saying something, and then Gaki.
Yes. Yeah, I was just trying to think about what my colleague have said about why do we victimize now the people of other faith than what we believe, we believe in. And I was thinking about that in a format that a school, I think a school is a political entity. And a school being a political entity, as maybe one or two of us would agree with what I'm saying. Each and every institution has its own philosophy and its own politics. Just trying to look at this university as a school is a Christian school. And maybe based on the policies that are already established, one would say maybe the issue of chapel, that maybe some people said that it's mandatory. We have that Tuesday dedicated to the Lord, those hours in the River Campus, from maybe let's say 8:30 to 9:30. That 1 hour, maybe 1 hour 30 minutes is dedicated to the Lord. That you coming from another faith or another background as a teacher, and you feel like you should teach during those hours, I think it's out of the norms. And thinking that having in mind that all religions are all we should be respected based on our background, that you should come maybe and introduce a cut at that time that was reserved for chapel. You will be out of norm. Now, what I mean, what I would want just to say is this: as a political entity and as an institution that has the established policies, it would be good if you come here and or if you want to send your kid to this particular school, to go through the policies and look at what will affect your kid, maybe what will not affect them, so that you may make a thorough choice instead of blaming others that they didn't accommodate your faith. That is my take.
So I think that is in response to Nyawita, that then plays into the hands of intolerance. But then you're saying then it's a personal choice. If you do not want to, be like them, go and find a place where you find people that worship like you do. Gaki?
Thank you, Dr. Rick. I'm still giving in my input on what Nyawita had initially given as the issue, and even given a concern rather, and even given an example to do with SDA students not being accommodated in a Christian school. Now, I appreciate that we're not looking at it in the sense that a school cannot accommodate everyone, because it's quite a dynamic issue in this sense. There's the theological and philosophical inclination of every institution when they are starting, just as Obadiah has given us a case scenario about DESTA. Now, I'll still use the same example about the SDA school setup. I have a friend, close friend in that matter, who has worked with the SDA school or a school that has that foundation. And you know what they normally do is that they don't work on Saturdays, but on Sunday, they have to work. But remember, it's not everyone who is an SDA in this particular teaching environment. However, my concern would mainly be, are they limited to worship? Probably they might not be allowed to go to worship on Saturday because their exams at that time, but does the school provide other spaces for them to actually pray or even worship, so that we're not letting them, we're not just totally saying SDA students or probably Catholics or Protestants, you cannot worship, no, or even Muslim students in a Christian school. The issue would be, we might not all align within the same or gather within the same aspect, but is the school accommodative to create other spaces which are not necessarily in alignment with what you'd actually prefer? That is the time of worship and day of worship. Thank you.
Okay. So again, we go round the same circle, that we might not be able to accommodate everyone and everyone's religious or faith tradition or background. And so I don't know where this is leading to, but I think that might be a hard, ball to play in today's religious pluralism. And so that's why many institutions of higher learning, or just basically institutions of learning, whether higher or not, have chosen to be secular or non-denominational or non-religious. Yes, Nyawita. Maybe in closing.
Yes, Dr. In closing, you're wondering where this is going. My issue per se wasn't about the institution exactly, but rather at individual levels, the level of intolerance we show towards other people's beliefs, while we ourselves, as we're studying in this class, seem to appreciate the Hebrew brothers for standing according to their faith. My desire, my prayer is that though we disagree, but we might be tolerant to people's beliefs and respect them, and even whether it is in school setup or in edu setup, and understand that yes, we don't believe the same thing, but if they're true to their God, then they should be. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I agree with you. Tolerance, tolerance, tolerance. Thank you. The last person we're going to look at today is Paul. And again, Paul's background speaks volumes in regard to the importance and centrality of education in shaping a society. But also when a trained person, an educated person, is in the hands of God, is a tool in the hands of God. Just look at how he describes himself in Acts chapter 22, verse 3. I'll read this for us. He says, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. All right. So at that time, he is where? In Acts 22. Where is he speaking from? So he's a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. Which city is he addressing these people from? Anyone?
I know in 17 he was in Athens. Now this other city he went to now, trying to capture that one from Athens now.
Okay. Yeah, remember that he's actually making a case for himself. In Acts, actually from 18 all the way, but 22, he finds himself having to make a case before a king, right? And he's surrounded by Jews, a lot of them who are accusing him for being an apostle. Okay, so he's basically addressing Jews. He's making the case of him being Jewish to make a case of it, to survive the persecution that was coming. And so,
Rome now.
yes. But this is very important what he says after. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. Speaking to Jews, right? So, who was Gamaliel? But we'll look at that later. Just some background check questions. First, Paul was a Jew. In fact, in one of his claims, in one of the epistles, I think, not quite sure, my memory is running, but where he talks about he counts everything as a loss for the sake of gaining Christ. It's Philippians,
Yes.
where he belittles his being Jew of a Jew, born a Jew born of a Jew, something of the sort.
Yeah, Philippians 3:5.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nyawita, for that. So he was a Jew, born in Tarsus. Now, Tarsus was the capital of the ancient province of Cilicia. If you look up Tarsus right now in the map, it's somewhere in Turkey. Somewhere in Turkey. But he also schooled under Gamaliel. So this guy is a mix of so many things. Schooled under Gamaliel. In the Christian tradition, Gamaliel was recognized as a Pharisee, doctor of Jewish law, highly respectable man. He was a man of great esteem, held in great esteem by all Jews. You see that in Acts chapter 5, 34 to 42. We'll not read that right now. But there was a contention about the apostles, the disciples of Jesus, who had been arrested for preaching the good news, and they were brought before the Sanhedrin. And while the Sanhedrin was deciding what to do with them, Gamaliel spoke, and he said, listen, guys, if these men, what they are doing is of God, it will remain. But if they are just men, we have seen others come before them, and they disappeared. And so what ended up with all this, they were just flogged and let go, and they were commanded not to speak in that name again. Okay? So so we are seeing a man of high esteem having been the mentor of Paul, the professor who taught Paul the law. And so this basically wraps his education background. Grew up in a synagogue. Therefore, at age 5, he learned the Orthodox Phariseeism. So he was a Pharisee, a very zealous one for that case, a Hebrew of Hebrews. At age 10, Jewish tradition teaches us that he learned in Mishnah, where he was taught Hebrew. At age 13, he went to the Hillel Rabbinical School, training under Gamaliel, this highly esteemed man, where and this is another school that had people from all over studying all kinds of philosophies and religions, but he had the exposure to Greek philosophy, exposure to Hebrew language and scriptures, and so he became a linguistic, right? And he was exposed to Hellenistic Judaism, which allowed for the Grecian learning and influence, even though his parents were devout Jews. Look at how diverse this boy was. And so in Tarsus, Paul became exposed to different cultures and teachings, as well as Orthodox Pharisaic Judaism. Tarsus was like a port city. It was a portland of some sort, where ships came from all over the world and docked. So you can imagine this was a highly cosmopolitan city which actually became a melting point of cultures. Paul is exposed to all this, which allowed him to learn classic Greek. All right. Now, what was the advantage of this? It was this classic Greek, which we call Koine Greek, which the New Testament is written in. So Paul was writing the classic Koine Greek. You know his letters. Of course, you know that Paul's writing formed 2/3 of the New Testament. So education background shaped his literary style and form of writing. Very high level. Of course, he was exposed to other disciplines too. And so his family background was a very wealthy background of tent makers. They were also Roman citizens, something which saved him, by the way. Him having this dual citizenship of being a Roman citizen, but also a Jewish citizen, saved his life at some point. Okay, so this is a very highly exposed person in the socio-economic and political structure of his environment. Okay, and so why is this important? Paul's education background is so important because God, in his divine wisdom and grace, exposed Paul to a wide spectrum of experiences and education, giving the apostle to the Gentiles the tools to effectively spread the gospel and establish the church solidly in all parts of the Roman Empire. So that was the whole point of him getting such an expensive and rich education background, so that he can be a tool in the hands of God to spread the good news. I have a question for us here to wrap it up for us. What is that one common thing with education systems, supposed to be plural, of Moses, Daniel, and his friends and Paul's time vis-a-vis the politics of the time? What is one running common thing with their education backgrounds vis-a-vis the politics of the time? Yes, Nyawita.
Thank you, Dr. One thing that I see running common in all the education is the power of education when a child is young. Moses could only remain true because of the education the mother gave him. Daniel and the three friends remained true because of the education they received first in Israel before becoming captives. Paul studies under Gamaliel and would later come back to God, but still his wealth of education that he learned at a young age could help him speak to both the Jews, but especially the Gentiles. So I find the foundational education being something that gives all of them power to stand later against the politics of the time.
Absolutely. So you see that running across all of them. I had that down, is that they were enabled to become revolutionaries during their time because of education. They turned, in your words, turned against the colonial political dispensation of their time. Very good. Zipporah, and then Othello.
I'm just trying to make. To me, I just
There's another to change that.
to me is that I can see how the culture of a person and belief plays a role in the kind of education we receive.
Okay. You mean the culture and the belief system of a people determines the kind of education that we receive? And I think for this case, you mean like for the Jewish cultural background, as you saw it in Deuteronomy 6, right? Thank you. Yes, Othello?
Yes, Dr. Ari, what I've seen there, the common thing I've seen there is these guys were thoroughly grounded. Even if in the case of Moses and Daniel and his friends, if he had been maybe in the other culture, they were thoroughly grounded in the education, which they later turned around. Of course, Paul was now being trained in the Jewish culture, and it's a Jewish professor who is leading him. They have been grounded. These guys are being grounded in a system so that they become knowledgeable and they become top guys in the society. And that's the only way they can become the revolutionaries that they were intended to be. So in that case, in those cases of Moses and Daniel and his friends, they had to turn it around after getting this thorough education, strong educational background. So they turned it around and for what God intended them to be, not what the cultures that they were indoctrinated in, like the Babylonian or the Chaldean culture and the Egyptian culture, not what it was intended for. So they turned it around. God turned it around. So the one thing is being thoroughly educated. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Very much in agreement with that. I think the first point that was made. Thank you, Othello. Yes, Nyawita?
Thank you, Dr. Excuse me, your class makes me think a lot. So just allow me to say this again, that I also see that the three of them are widely read. Moses taught first by the mother, then at a palace, and finally as a shepherd in the wilderness for 40 years. Extremely prepared educationally for what he was to do. Daniel learned as a royal kid, then later learned everything that involves Babylon and its knowledge, and that prepared him to survive through up to time of Darius. Paul is extremely well-versed. In fact, when he goes to the Athens, he quotes their own poet. And I think this wide knowledge helps them, which makes me wonder about these families who insist on teaching their kids, let's say homeschooling, purely according to their religion and the things they want the kids to learn. And I'm wondering, are they really preparing them to be revolutionaries? Just a thought. Thank you.
Are they preparing them for the world? And maybe just a follow-up question on that, Nyawita, is it, can we send our kids to education backgrounds and systems of other philosophical thinking that does not align with ours and still come out well?
I'll let my colleagues give their thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah. So good question. It's just a follow-up to what you said. Yes, Florence.
I wanted to say, I think, yes, you can. The Bible says, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they grow up, they will not depart from it. So that means whatever the foundation in terms of values and all that, that you have put in them when they're still young, they will not depart from it. Hence, Moses comes to a point where he's asked by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And he hesitates at first, but he takes it on because of the linkage that he got from his mother and his family. So I think you can actually train up a child early enough, samaki mkunje angali mbichi, make sure they get what you need them to get, and then expose them to the world, because then that's how you test that particular value. Did it stick? Did it not stick?
Very good. Very good. I like that. You're just applying what is common to the three of the examples that we've seen, that in the end, they reverted to their original religious educational background without losing what they gained from other kinds of education and systems. And so a gel of the two made them even better in who they became to bring about the revolution that they were part of. Yes, Sam, and then Obadiah.
Doctor, I wanted to ask you a question. You asked the question as to whether or not we can send our children for an education whose philosophy is different from our own. And I'm wondering, what business would I have sending my children to follow a philosophy that doesn't agree with mine? Is that even possible?
Basically, okay, more than just a philosophy, but I'm just using philosophy very generically here to mean even a religion. Like, say, let me simplify it. you are a Christian, you send your child to a Hindu school.
In that case, won't I be failing in my responsibility as a parent? I mean, the God-given responsibility of a parent.
Isn't this what we are seeing in Daniel and even in Moses?
Sorry to interject, Doc, but I want to remind Nyabere, you have taught in Oshwal. Nyabere, you've taught those students. So what's the difference? Say for the religion, they still stand for whatever they were taught at home. I think Macho brought it in right very well. Sorry, I'm on the road, but I had to do that so that Nyabere cannot forget his roots.
No, Yvonne, I was teaching those children English and literature, and I wasn't subscribing to their religious philosophy. I am thinking about sending my son to study Hindu, and I'm a Christian. Will I not be betraying my own faith?
Sam, maybe if I can just help. I think for me, my understanding is that the foundations that we give our children need to be solid so that wherever they land, because Moses' mother puts him in a basket. She didn't know that she was going to land in Pharaoh's home, but he ends up landing there. But see, later in life, we see those values about his people and the love of his people actually even cause him to kill someone. And later he's used by God to rescue the same people. So the idea here is not necessarily just school. And I think Professor Airo keeps on talking about how he has read Quran and all these other religious texts. It just expounds your knowledge. And I think I always say that a child does not stop being a child. You're your mother's child even now, Chris. And maybe he might, if he hears you've gone to a mosque, she hears you've gone to a mosque, she might shudder. My point is that we invest in our children early enough so that by peradventure they land somewhere else. Or they even go to Aga Khan school, or they go to Visa Osho, or this one that has a very long name. By being in that school with other kids from the Hindu faith, they will not change who that child is because of the foundation that you laid, which is your God-given responsibility based on your faith.
Yeah, that I perfectly understand, Doc, and I want to end here. When I asked this question,
Chris,
it was
thank you for calling me
purposes.
Doc.
Remember, we are all responding to our lecturer, and we are not supposed to be talking to each other directly, except through him. So I was saying this, that it has to be known that I right now work in the midst of Muslims, and I'm in a country where there is no other Christian. There is no church. There is nothing like that, where I have to try so much not to, to be swallowed into their religion. My argument originally was, as a parent, I need to ground my children in my philosophy, in my faith. And so when Doc asked whether we can send our children to pursue an education whose philosophy is different from our own, I was feeling like if that were to be the case, then I would be betraying my own philosophy. And so I thought, for me as a parent, I have to ground my children in the philosophy that I believe in. But now, when you extend the education to other things other than a personal philosophy, I understand perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Actually, can I just sum up by saying this? I can be a thief as a parent, but of course, knowing that whatever I'm doing is wrong, but then decide to bring up my children in a way that is correct and to make them not to be thieves. I'm answering Sam. What am I saying? that it is not necessary that my philosophy should be the one that my children should be following. I could be in a wrong philosophy, but then, as he says, try and make my children to be in the other philosophy which I feel it is right. Because then I would be in this philosophy because I just want to make a living. I have been privileged to work in Northeastern for over 3 years. And parents who take their children to Al-Shabaab just because of money and because they want to make a living out of it. You could ask yourself, this is the best philosophy a parent would do. At the end of the day, a parent has to do that because he wants to get some money to feed other children that are remaining. And therefore, it is not necessarily that whatever I'm doing as a parent is the right thing. But then I need to try and bring the rest of the children in the right way, not necessarily my way. Thank you.
Yes, very, very well said. And let me just give 1 minute each to Nyawita, Juliet, and Obadiah, because I want to bring this to a close. 1 minute each.
Thank you, Dr. I would like to concur with some that as a parent, I will take my child directly to a place where they believe something else, because Daniel and Moses were victims of circumstance. But I will also like to say that age matters. There's an age, if you send your child to another philosophy, they will not come back. So we all meet these people after they are teens somewhere thereabout. So I think in the early years, ensure they understand your philosophy. Then when they become, let's say, high school, they're about, as Florence had said, they will not forget it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nyawita. Obadiah?
Yeah, I think
Juliet, sorry.
No, it's okay. Obadiah can go ahead.
Yes, maybe yeah, mine is more of appreciation of what my colleagues have aired. But I want to reserve my opinion on whether I should send my kid because I think that is exposing them. And if given a chance, I would think about it carefully. But I want to encourage mothers that we have in the group. I'm a very fan of this a very it's an educationist by name Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I hope that we've ever read about him. He said something that I think I learned in my early career days. He said that the first education is given by a mother. And if God intended it to be father's responsibility, he would have provided them with the ability to breastfeed the kid. Thank you.
Dr. Go ahead. I think my point has been, they have mentioned what I was to say. Go ahead. I'm saying just, okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. I would like to culminate, to bring all this into culmination. I think I had already shown you the Israel model of education, of what God has stipulated in the law, that education was to be transmitted. And I call this education leadership. But just to wind up, I want to get a very good reader who will read for us in closing from the book of Hebrews 11, verses 24 to 27. This will be our closing remark. And before it's read, let me first of all get who wants to read that. Just a very good reader. Hebrews 11, 24. I have Maureen and Jimmy. Can you share? Let's share between Maureen and Jimmy. And then Janie, and Janie will read 28 as a closing. 28. Okay.
Jimmy, start.
Starting from 24 to 27.
Yes.
Okay, good. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known, was to be ill-treated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of great because he was looking ahead.
Jimmy, you're breaking, and they're very important. There are very important sentences there. I think you're breaking. Could you start again? 24.
Okay, sorry, am I clear now?
Yes, now you're clear.
Okay, allow me to begin once again. By faith, Moses, when he had grown, be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be ill-treated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible.
Okay, and someone, I think it's who?
Maureen.
Yes.
Yes, 28
Russ,
to, yeah, reading 28 to.
just 28.
Okay. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Word of God.
Amen. Education in application. And I think for us, that for me explains what might have gone so wrong with the byproduct of our education today. That in thinking educational leadership, we have allowed so much of politics, and I think it was I forget who it was last time who was dreading the conversation around politics in education and advised us to keep politics away from education. I think there could be a better way of putting those words and actually in action that we become so revolutionary in our establishment of a good education system that returns us to the foundations of the Lord. Because you can imagine, even after Moses had had such an exposure like we have seen, actually refuses that identity because he refused to be called that naming again, which basically was who he was. He refused to be called son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So he's literally running away from a lifestyle, a society that was godless because he didn't see any future in it. He didn't see any development, consciousness for the people, for his people. So question for us educational leaders in training is, do we have the same resolve? Are we pursuing similar ambitions in life to be co-creators with God in what he has done, but to push for an education that is going to create and turn our young people from just consumers of content to revolutionaries, people that are able to think and do as per they have been taught to bring about a change in society. Because the politics of the land, as some of you said earlier, will want to close our minds and control so that we play into the hands of the politics of the day. But you see, for Moses, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. How did he know about Christ then? These were many years before Christ was even born. Okay. By faith, he left Egypt. So there's a moment of Exodus. He is leaving Egypt. But I want you to take this as a picture, as a word picture of leaving. Leaving Egypt. Not being afraid of the king's anger. Then, look at that last verse that has been read. By faith, he kept the Passover. How did he learn about the Passover? This was part and parcel of the Jewish religious practice. Okay? Entrenched in their education from when kids were young. And somebody made that comment here, that train kids while they are young, the values and cultures of the people. So he sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. And this is how Israel and the family of Israel were saved from the angel of death. Friends, I don't know what this means for you, but I want to assume that by now, you are the pros in this area. You know that the powers that be have an interest in education. But you and I know that the intention is not good. But now we are here and we are getting this conversation going. Question is, what are we going to do beyond this classroom to make an impact and raise kids, raise students, raise scholars who are going to bring about a change that we have seen in Moses, in Daniel, and in Paul. Okay. Amen. I think I'm done for tonight. Yes, Peter, in closing.
Dr. In closing, what I'm coming with from this class is that as parents, we really need to teach our children our philosophies and their traditions. And I'm feeling sad for parents who think that it is bad, it is backward to teach their children their mother tongue. If I'm a Luo, I feel bad that my child should understand our culture, our language, because these children start growing not knowing the original culture and cannot grasp fully the modern culture, the English and the Kiswahili. That culture, they might know the language, but not the culture. And so eventually they become very useless people. But if they had a grounding on their culture, they will identify, they will have an identity. That's something I'm thinking as we come to the end of this class. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's just a reminder that let's not forget our roots. Thank you for that, Nyawita. So, class, I think I've come to the end of our session for tonight. Just one issue that I think was brought out by one of us. Let me go to the assignment that is due today at 8:30 p.m. I am going to...
Mwalimu, you said midnight.
Yes, I'm going to extend it right now. I'm going to extend it to morning for the late night people.
Thank you. I've
And
just arrived, so I'm finalizing mine. Sante.
so I'm giving a grace period to tomorrow morning. So please make sure that everything is in. Yeah. Okay, let me take the attendance. I just want to take a screenshot of those who are in. I hope that you have your name as it is in the registry.
Secretary, maybe you could confirm after the submission is done. Those who have sent. You know, sometimes you send and it remains